The lake had always been more than just a body of water. For generations, it was the quiet soul of the property, a mirror of the sky and seasons, a provider of fish, and a retreat for reflection. For me, it was both a family inheritance and a sanctuary from the growing chaos of suburban encroachment. When I inherited the ranch and its private lake, I knew it carried responsibilities: conservation, upkeep, and stewardship. The lake wasn't just a pond in the backyard. It was fed by underground springs and had always remained pristine, teeming with bass, catfish, and trout that sustained both wildlife and the occasional family gathering. But the landscape around me had been changing. The town expanded. Housing developments crept closer. Then came the Homeowners Association, a sprawling suburban maze of cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns that sprouted like weeds along the lake's edge. At first, they treated my land as a curiosity, something quaint that sat alongside their engineered perfection. But as months passed, their attitude shifted. They saw my lake as an eyesore, a wild piece of nature that clashed with their ornamental fountains and chemically brightened lawns. The real flashpoint, however, was fishing. I loved taking a rod to the dock, especially in the early mornings when mist hung low over the water. To me, fishing was peace. To the HOA, it became a spectacle they despised. They claimed it looked unsightly for someone to fish near their community walking trails. They whispered that it gave the neighborhood the feel of a rural backwater, as though peace and nature had no place next to their cement sidewalks and HOA-issued benches. At first, I ignored the complaints. After all, this was my land, my lake, and my right. But the HOA never left things at polite disapproval. Their board meetings grew more pointed with mentions of property value degradation. They sent letters filled with bureaucratic nonsense, attempting to dictate what I could and couldn't do. When those didn't work, they tried intimidation, showing up at my gate, pressing me to be a good neighbor, and suggesting I stop fishing altogether. I held my ground. If anything, their harassment made me fish more often, as a matter of principle. Every cast of the line was a quiet act of defiance, a reminder that I wouldn't be bullied into giving up something so simple and sacred. That was when the whispers began. People reported strange activity near the lake at night. Figures moving with flashlights, shadows gathering near the shore. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to kids trespassing. But then, slowly, things began to change in the water. The fish started dying. At first, it was one or two floating near the reeds. Then dozens, their silver bodies glinting in the sun as they drifted lifeless on the surface. The smell of decay followed, sour and pungent, and soon the entire shoreline was littered with corpses of bass and trout that had once thrived there. The water itself grew murky, no longer the clear reflection of the sky, but a sickly shade, tinged with greenish film that clung to the edges like oil. Birds stopped visiting. Deer avoided the shore. Even the insects that usually danced above the surface seemed to vanish. The lake had gone from vibrant life to haunting silence in a matter of weeks. My heart sank with every passing day. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I called in environmental experts who tested the water. Their reports confirmed what I had already suspected. Toxins had been introduced deliberately. The specific compounds pointed to herbicides and chemical runoff in quantities far beyond what nature or accident could explain. Someone had poisoned the lake. Rage burned hotter than grief. This wasn't just vandalism. This was destruction of something irreplaceable, a deliberate act meant to hurt me, to strip away the one thing that connected me to my family's legacy. And I didn't have to wonder long about who would benefit. The HOA. They had made their distaste known, their threats clear. And now, with the fish gone and the water choked with chemicals, their goal seemed obvious: to make fishing impossible, to strip me of the simple joy they resented so much. But they hadn't stopped to consider that the lake wasn't just mine. It was theirs too, in ways they hadn't realized. For years, the HOA had tapped into groundwater wells that fed from the same aquifers beneath my land. Their manicured lawns, their decorative fountains, their irrigation systems all depended on the very same water that nourished my lake. By poisoning it, they had poisoned themselves. It would take time, perhaps months, but the contamination would spread through the underground veins, seeping into their pipes and faucets. The irony was bitter and satisfying all at once. They had sought to destroy me by targeting the lake, never realizing they had severed their own lifeline. But satisfaction wasn't enough. This was my family's land, my lake, and I wouldn't let their arrogance go unpunished. I began to gather evidence. Trail cameras were hidden along the banks, capturing late-night intrusions. I collected samples of the water at different points, documenting the spreading contamination. I reached out to local authorities, but as expected, the HOA had friends in high places, city council members, local inspectors, even a few deputies. Complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated. Reports were buried. The HOA thought they were untouchable, but what they didn't know was that I wasn't just relying on local channels. I had state-level environmental contacts from past work in conservation, and they didn't take lightly to the deliberate poisoning of a protected freshwater source. Quietly, methodically, I began building a case that would expose not just the HOA's actions, but the broader consequences of their recklessness. The lake itself became a silent witness, its poisoned waters a testament to their greed and malice. And as I stood on the dock one evening, staring out at the still, lifeless surface, I made a vow. They wanted to strip me of fishing, of peace, of heritage, but in their blind obsession with control, they had struck at something far larger than me. They had awakened a storm they could never contain. The stillness of the lake that evening was deceptive. Beneath the surface, toxins spread, currents shifted, and nature prepared its own reckoning. And in the shadows of that quiet water, my plan began to take form. The HOA thought they had won a petty battle. They hadn't yet realized they had ignited a war, and the first tremors of that war were about to shake the very ground they stood on. In the weeks that followed the poisoning, the HOA board congratulated themselves quietly, thinking they had silenced me. They assumed that a dead lake meant the end of fishing, the end of their imagined nuisance, and the start of their dominance over the property. From their perspective, it was victory, clean, efficient, and hidden beneath a veil of denial. But nature has a way of exposing arrogance. The first signs of their mistake appeared in subtle, almost laughable ways. The HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman known for her obsession with pristine landscaping, began complaining that her prized roses were wilting despite constant watering. Other board members noted that their lawns, once green and uniform, developed strange brown patches that spread like infection across the neighborhood. At first, they blamed landscapers, irrigation systems, and the weather. They poured more fertilizer, more chemicals, and more money into their lawns, never realizing they were feeding poison into the soil. The fountains, once the HOA's pride, gurgling with crystal-clear water for joggers and dog walkers to admire, took on a cloudy film. Residents whispered about the smell, faint at first, then stronger, like rotting vegetation. Children who played too close developed rashes. Dogs refused to drink from the fountains, tugging their leashes away from the once refreshing streams. The HOA board tried to downplay it, sending out emails reassuring residents that routine maintenance would resolve the issue. But behind closed doors, they were scrambling. I watched this unfold with a quiet, grim satisfaction. The poisoned lake, once their triumph, was now bleeding into their community's veins. My trail cameras had captured their midnight trespasses. My water samples proved the presence of compounds far beyond natural contamination. But I did not act too soon. Timing was everything. I wanted them to feel the weight of their decisions before unveiling the truth. The unraveling escalated quickly. Within 2 months, the HOA received its first official complaint from residents about the drinking water itself. Families noticed a metallic tang, a bitterness that lingered after boiling. Some reported stomach sickness, others skin irritation. The HOA attempted to brush it off, blaming seasonal changes in municipal water. But the problem was undeniable. Their wells, connected directly to the aquifers beneath my poisoned lake, were carrying the contamination straight into their homes. Panic began to spread like the very toxins they had unleashed. Residents grew suspicious, demanding answers at HOA meetings. The once confident board faltered under questioning, stammering excuses and offering vague promises of investigation. Their iron grip on the neighborhood began to crack. From my vantage point, it was almost poetic. The same people who had mocked me for clinging to old traditions were now desperate for the very water they had poisoned. The lake they tried to silence had become their tormentor, whispering reminders of their arrogance through every faucet and hose. Yet I did not gloat openly. Revenge done properly required patience, evidence, and strategy. I documented everything. Photos of dying fish, videos of trespassers, laboratory-certified reports of water toxins, all carefully archived. And while I built my case, I prepared for the moment when the HOA would come crawling, desperate for a solution to the disaster of their own making. That moment arrived sooner than expected. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, a convoy of HOA board members pulled up outside my gate. They came dressed in their business casual uniforms, clipboards tucked under their arms, faces tight with false smiles. They called for me, their voices carrying the thin veneer of politeness that barely masked their desperation. They wanted to talk, to negotiate, to work together for the community. I did not answer. I stood hidden in the shadows of the porch, watching them fidget, sweat, and mutter amongst themselves. They had trespassed and destroyed, and now, like cowards, they sought to erase their sins with shallow diplomacy. When no one came to greet them, they left pamphlets stuffed in my mailbox, offers of cooperation, veiled threats softened by insincere apologies. The truth was simple. They didn't want cooperation. They wanted rescue. Their empire of manicured lawns and staged perfection was collapsing, and they saw me as their only chance to save it. But I wasn't about to hand them an easy escape. They would pay, not only with exposure, but with humiliation. Meanwhile, the community at large turned restless. The residents, who once cheered the board's strict rules and petty enforcement, now began to resent them. Rumors spread that the HOA had mishandled water safety. Mothers whispered in fear at playgrounds. Fathers muttered curses at board meetings, and teenagers mocked the fountains that now sat drained and cordoned off with yellow tape. The HOA's carefully crafted image of control was fracturing under the weight of poisoned water. To add insult to injury, the state environmental investigators I had quietly contacted weeks earlier began their work. They arrived discreetly at first, taking samples, interviewing residents, combing through records. The HOA board tried to posture as cooperative, but their nervousness betrayed them. They knew that evidence of their midnight poisonings would not remain buried forever. I watched with quiet resolve as nature, law, and community all turned against them. But even then, I wasn't finished. I wanted them to feel the creeping dread, to sense the walls closing in, to know that every lie they had built was about to crumble. The poisoned lake had become more than just a symbol of defiance. It had become the truth-teller, exposing hypocrisy and greed, forcing the HOA to confront the consequences of their own arrogance. Every drop of contaminated water flowing through their pipes was a reminder. They had waged war on something far older and more powerful than themselves. And as the weeks stretched into months, the board's power waned. Elections loomed, residents whispered of removing them, and lawsuits were whispered in hushed tones over backyard fences. The empire of control they had built on fear was now dissolving in the very water they had thoughtlessly tainted. But I wasn't satisfied yet. Justice wasn't complete. Exposure wasn't enough. The HOA had to be held accountable, not just in the eyes of neighbors, but in the eyes of the law. And I knew exactly how to deliver that reckoning. I had every shred of proof I needed. But evidence alone doesn't destroy an HOA. It takes timing, spectacle, and the courage to pull the trigger when the moment is right. And that moment was coming, carried on the poisoned currents of a lake they thought they could silence. The storm they had awakened was gathering momentum. And soon it would break upon them with a force they couldn't contain. The HOA's downfall did not begin with a sudden explosion, but with slow fractures. Hairline cracks in the foundation of their authority that widened with each passing week. At first, the board tried to keep up the illusion of control. They sent out carefully worded newsletters, insisting that the discoloration of the fountains was due to routine maintenance and that the strange taste in the water was a seasonal phenomenon. But residents were no longer convinced. It started with whispers between neighbors. Families confided in each other about rashes that wouldn't heal. pets that grew ill after drinking from outdoor spigots, and children who refused to bathe because the water smelled faintly of rot. The HOA dismissed these complaints as isolated incidents, but the evidence was undeniable. The neighborhood, once meticulously curated and micromanaged, was becoming a place of distrust and suspicion. The residents began comparing notes. They realized their problems weren't unique. They were shared, widespread, and worsening. By the time the third child was rushed to urgent care with unexplained vomiting, the whispers turned to outrage. Parents demanded answers, homeowners questioned the safety of their investments, and even the staunchest HOA supporters began to doubt the board's reassurances. The turning point came during one of the monthly HOA meetings. The board had expected the usual complacency, a crowd of polite nods and passive acceptance. Instead, the room was filled with angry voices, waving medical bills, photographs of diseased lawns, and jars of cloudy tap water as evidence. The board tried to stammer through their script, but the residents were no longer listening. They shouted over the speeches, demanded resignations, and accused the leadership of hiding something far darker than poor maintenance. For the first time, the board felt the shift. The power they had wielded for years, enforced through fines and threats, now slipped like sand through their fingers. The residents were no longer afraid. They were angry. From my porch, I watched the slow implosion unfold with grim satisfaction. The same board members who once strutted past my property, confident in their authority, were now reduced to nervous, stammering figures trying to calm a mob they had created. Every day I collected more evidence. I had videos of them trespassing near the lake, audio of them conspiring about making fishing impossible, and a growing pile of reports showing the spread of contamination from the lake into the wells that fed their community, but I wasn't the only one watching. The state environmental investigators were returning frequently now, their vehicles parked conspicuously in the neighborhood. They carried clipboards, took soil samples, and asked questions that made residents shift uncomfortably. The board tried to portray themselves as cooperative, but the investigators weren't fooled. They had already seen enough to know that this wasn't an accident. The residents noticed the investigators too. The sight of officials testing their lawns and peering into their drains only deepened their suspicion. What had once been blind trust in the HOA had become open hostility. The board was no longer the protector of property values, but the source of a growing scandal. The tension spilled into everyday life. Neighbors who had once smiled politely across white picket fences now muttered accusations. Some blamed the board for negligence. Others whispered that someone had done something to the lake. A few even began to suspect me, wondering if I had somehow engineered the contamination as revenge for years of harassment. The rumors swirled, but I stayed silent. I didn't need to defend myself yet. The truth was in the evidence, and soon it would roar louder than any rumor. The board, desperate to salvage their reputation, began making uncharacteristic concessions. They offered to waive fines, postpone dues, and even suggested lowering assessments for the year. But these gestures were too little, too late. Residents weren't interested in discounts, they wanted accountability. They wanted clean water, answers, and justice. The anger spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations caught wind of the story. At first, it was a brief segment, a community facing unusual water issues. But as more residents came forward with footage of dead fish, diseased lawns, and jars of foul-smelling tap water, the coverage deepened. Cameras began showing up at HOA meetings, and reporters pushed microphones at the board members who had once wielded power with smug authority. Now their faces were pale, their words fumbling. The board had gone from enforcers to villains in the eyes of their own residents. The empire of fines and control they had built was collapsing under the weight of poisoned water and public scrutiny, and yet they still hadn't admitted the truth. They continued to hide behind vague excuses, praying that blame would fall on natural causes or bureaucratic red tape. But the state investigators weren't buying it. They had traced the contamination back to the lake, and they knew, just as I did, that it had been deliberate. The investigators began interviewing residents about strange activity near the lake. People recalled seeing flashlights at night, hearing footsteps, or noticing chemical containers tucked away in the brush. Slowly, the picture came together. This was no accident, and the board's fingerprints were all over it. Behind the scenes, I prepared my final move. I had all the evidence, neatly organized, ready to be handed over at the right moment. But more importantly, I had patience. I wanted the HOA to feel the walls closing in, to know they had no allies left, no lies strong enough to shield them. I wanted them to beg for relief, only to realize too late that the relief they sought would come at the cost of their own destruction. The lake, silent and lifeless, reflected the unfolding chaos like a mirror. It had been their target, their victim, but it had also become the weapon that would undo them. Every poisoned drop had carried justice into their homes, into their pipes, into the very heart of their control, and still, the storm gathered strength. The residents, emboldened by their anger, began organizing outside of the board's control. Meetings popped up in garages and backyards, discussions of forming coalitions, even whispers of lawsuits. The same community the board had once dominated with rules and fines was now uniting against them. The cracks had become chasms, and through them the truth seeped steadily. The board didn't know it yet, but they were living on borrowed time. Their empire was collapsing, their secrets unraveling, and soon the reckoning they feared most would arrive in a form they couldn't stop. Because the poisoned lake had not only exposed their arrogance, it had turned their own community against them, and when neighbors turn on those who claim to lead them, the fall is swift and brutal. By the time summer reached its peak, the HOA board's grip on the neighborhood had all but evaporated. The once proud enforcers of every petty rule were now reduced to shadows, slipping between homes under cover of night, too afraid to face the outrage boiling among their residents. What had begun as whispered complaints had become full-blown rebellion. The lawns told the story first. Rows of once green grass, carefully maintained under the watchful eye of HOA inspectors, now stood brown and patchy. Sprinkler systems coughed out water that stank faintly of chemicals, leaving streaks of yellow where it landed. Flower beds that had once won neighborhood awards now withered into brittle stalks, their petals burned by unseen toxins. The uniform beauty the HOA had once used as its badge of superiority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Then came the fountains. Once the crown jewels of the community, they now sat drained, cracked, and useless. The cloudy water that had once sputtered from them had been replaced by silence and weeds growing between the stones. Parents refused to let their children near them, and joggers avoided the park trails altogether. The fountains, once symbols of wealth and order, had become monuments to failure. But the collapse wasn't just physical. It was social, political, and deeply personal. The residents no longer saw the board as leaders. They saw them as liars. Meetings turned hostile, with shouting matches lasting hours. Board members were cornered in parking lots, berated on sidewalks, and shunned at local stores. Families that had once upheld the HOA's rules with pride now tore up violation notices, tossed newsletters into the trash, and openly mocked the board's attempts at control. The board tried desperately to regain their authority. They issued frantic memos blaming the city for water issues, suggesting residents install expensive filtration systems at their own cost. They begged for patience, claiming that solutions were in progress. But every word only deepened suspicion. The residents had already begun taking matters into their own hands. They formed committees independent of the HOA, gathering in garages and backyards to share evidence, discuss strategy, and plan legal action. Lawyers were contacted, petitions were circulated, and whispers of a class action lawsuit grew louder with each passing day. The board, once the sole authority in the community, was now the target of a growing movement that sought their removal, if not outright ruin. Through it all, I stayed quiet, patient, and watchful. My cameras still captured the occasional trespasser near the lake, board members checking the damage, pacing nervously along the poisoned shore. My evidence folder grew thicker, packed with water reports, time-stamped footage, and sworn affidavits from experts who had traced the contamination directly to the compounds dumped into my lake. The State Environmental Agency had returned in force. Their vehicles no longer parked discreetly, but right in the middle of the neighborhood, their investigators striding openly with clipboards and cameras. They collected samples from homes, wells, and soil, their expressions grim as they compiled proof. Everyone in the community could see it now. This was no seasonal change, no routine maintenance. This was a crime. The board's last defense, silence, crumbled under the weight of public exposure. Local news crews descended on the neighborhood, their cameras capturing footage of angry residents waving jars of brown water, children with rashes on their arms and dead fish bloating along the edges of the lake. Reporters hounded the board members at their homes, thrusting microphones into their faces, demanding answers they couldn't give. The once pristine image of the HOA shattered completely. Instead of respectable community leaders, they were now painted as reckless villains who had poisoned their own residents in a misguided bid for control. And still, I waited. The time to reveal my role was close. But I wanted the board to feel the full weight of despair first. I wanted them to know that no ally remained, no excuse could save them, and no amount of spin could rewrite the truth. They had poisoned the lake, and in doing so, they had poisoned their future. The collapse grew sharper when the first lawsuits were officially filed. A group of parents, furious over medical bills from their children's illnesses, banded together and hired a high-profile attorney. The suit named the HOA board directly, citing negligence, environmental damage, and health risks. The news spread like wildfire, emboldening more residents to join in. Soon, the board was facing a tidal wave of legal challenges that threatened to drown them entirely. Their finances crumbled next. Insurance companies refused coverage, citing deliberate misconduct. The HOA's reserve funds, once swollen with fees and fines collected from residents, drained quickly as they tried to pay legal bills and cover emergency maintenance costs. Notices went unpaid, debts piled up, and whispers of bankruptcy grew louder. For the first time, the board members themselves began to fracture. Paranoia set in. Neighbors reported seeing them argue in driveways, shouting accusations at one another. One member resigned quietly, slipping out of the neighborhood in the middle of the night, leaving only a curt email behind. Another began leaking internal documents to residents, desperate to shield themselves from the fallout. The empire of control, once united in its arrogance, was eating itself alive, and still, the lake sat in silence, a dark mirror of the chaos it had unleashed. Its poisoned water spread slowly, methodically, through the aquifers, carrying their crime into every faucet, every hose, every drop of water that touched the community. The very thing they sought to destroy had become the judge, jury, and executioner of their arrogance. For me, the collapse was both vindication and sorrow. Vindication, because their cruelty had finally caught up with them. Sorrow, because the lake, the heart of my family's land, had been desecrated in the process. But I knew this story wasn't over. Justice wasn't just about watching them fail. It was about making sure their crime was remembered, punished, and never repeated. The investigators were nearly finished with their work. I had been in quiet contact with them, offering evidence without revealing everything at once. Soon the final report would be delivered, and with it, the fate of the board would be sealed. But even as their empire collapsed, the board clung desperately to denial. They still tried to spin, to claim ignorance, to point fingers at anyone but themselves. They didn't realize yet that I held the final key, the irrefutable proof of their trespass, their poisoning, and their conspiracy. The community was ready to burn them down. The state was ready to prosecute. The lawsuits were ready to drain them, and I was ready to strike the final blow. Their last acts of desperation were the clumsiest. When someone knows the ground is crumbling beneath them, the instinct is to dig faster rather than step back. The HOA board, stripped of dignity and bereft of plausible deniability, began a series of frantic, crooked maneuvers intended to hide evidence, intimidate witnesses, and buy themselves time. Each maneuver only made the case against them sharper. It started with obstruction. Important files went missing from the HOA office. Maintenance logs, invoices, purchase orders that might have linked the board to supply shops selling the herbicides. An employee who had requested time off was suddenly terminated for reasons that smelled of contrivance. Emails disappeared, and when subpoenas arrived, versions of documents surfaced that were clearly altered. The deeper they sank into deceit, the more transparent their panic became to anyone paying attention. Then came the more personal tactics. A few residents who had been vocal at meetings received late-night visits. Anonymous flyers slipped under their doors accusing them of sabotage, veiled threats sent in the form of voicemail noises, and on one chilling occasion, a neighbor's tires slashed while their family slept. The board did not publicly condone these actions, but they did not seem particularly interested in stopping them either. It was the behavior of an organization convinced that intimidation could stitch together its shredded reputation. I watched all of it in grim detail. My evidence stack grew thicker. Time-stamped footage from trail cams showing board members moving suspiciously near the lake after midnight. Receipts from a rural feed store for containers of agricultural herbicide that matched toxicology reports. Phone records tying certain board members to late-night calls with landscapers who swore in depositions that they had been hired under false names to treat invasive weeds. The investigators took everything, their notebooks filling with details that, when combined, formed an unassailable narrative of intent. The board's mistakes multiplied. In trying to erase their tracks, they created new ones. One member, frantic and careless, attempted to burn a set of handwritten notes in a secluded bin near the community garden. A jogger found the smoldering pages and, alarmed, photographed them. The charred fragments, once pieced together by forensics, contained enough legible words, dates, product names, shorthand instructions, to directly contradict the board's claims of ignorance. The state's investigators, now working with prosecutors and health officials, moved deliberately. They knew the power of sequence. Evidence assembled methodically is harder to dismiss than allegations thrown at the wind. The investigators coordinated with the local news teams not to sensationalize but to ensure transparency. When they announced a public briefing, the turnout was enormous. Cameras lined the township hall. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, faces hollowed by weeks of fear and anger. I watched from the periphery, camera in hand, feeling a cold, fierce satisfaction as the investigators laid out the findings. The report was devastating. Chemical markers matched the compounds dumped into the lake. Contamination gradients traced outward from the shoreline toward the aquifers. Purchase receipts, GPS pings, and surveillance footage grouped together like pieces of a puzzle that left little room for doubt. The phrase that would haunt the board's remaining defenders was simple and stark: deliberate discharge. When the investigators released names, nods spread through the crowd like a wave. A few residents turned away, unable to reconcile the faces they had greeted at barbecues and block parties with the people accused of poisoning the neighborhood's water. For some, the betrayal was a blow that would take years to recover from. For others, it was righteous vindication, confirmation that the intuition they'd ignored in favor of trust had been right all along. Legal action followed immediately. Civil suits were filed by dozens of homeowners who sought damages for medical bills, lost property value, and emotional distress. The class action complaint was meticulous, cataloging every instance of illness, every ruined garden, and every evidence file linking the board to the crime. Insurance companies, faced with a file that spelled out intentional wrongdoing, moved to deny coverage. The board's coffers drained, and their lawyers, once confident, began whispering about settlement and plea deals. Criminal charges were the next hammer to fall. Prosecutors, backed by the Environmental Laboratory's chain of custody documentation and expert testimony, brought counts of environmental tampering, endangerment, and conspiracy. Arrest warrants were served with the certainty of inevitability. One by one, members of the board were taken from their homes in the early morning fog, their faces stunned, their neighbors watching in aghast silence. The image of those officers escorting them, hands cuffed, eyes hollow, was broadcast across local news that night and would play on repeat in the days to come. But the most damning evidence was not paperwork or forensics. It was the people. Neighbors who had once been intimidated now stepped forward. The landscaper, whose conscience had finally taken hold, testified in court about nights spent dumping chemicals into a wheelbarrow near the reed beds. The community gardener, who had found traces of active compounds in the compost, described how children's pet goldfish had died after drinking from a rain barrel that connected, unwittingly, to the contaminated source. Even a board member, sobbing and full of regret, made a plea deal and provided recordings of late-night meetings where the plan had been discussed in chillingly clear terms. Public shaming was a blunt instrument, but a powerful one. The social fabric that the board had woven for years, dinner parties, holiday decorations, polite smiles, unraveled under the bright light of truth. Friendships split, families turned on one another, and the comfortable social hierarchies that had defined the neighborhood collapsed. The HOA's gated aura of respectability was gone, replaced by a raw communal grief at having been betrayed by its own caretakers. Throughout the days of trials, deposits, and depositions, the lake remained. Its surface had become a quotidian testament to what had been lost. Sometimes it lay black and glossy like spilled ink. Other times, storm-churned and bruised. Remediation teams began the slow work of cleaning, pumping, filtering, and chemically neutralizing where possible, but the science of aquifers is stubborn. Groundwater does not move on a schedule anyone would choose. The aquifers absorbed what had been introduced, and flushing that poison would take years, if not decades. I watched the remediation with a complicated heart. Justice was satisfying in its clarity. The boards indicted, the lawsuits filed, the community mobilized, but the lake was still wounded. You cannot stitch back a community with legal filings alone. You cannot teach a child that the water running from their tap is safe after weeks of fear overnight. You cannot erase the image of dead fish lining a shoreline where your family once picnicked. The healing would be slow and required more than punitive measures. It required honest labor, transparency, and a willingness to rebuild trust. There were small victories. The board's earlier attempts to gag residents with non-disclosure agreements were declared unenforceable in light of public health interests. The PTO at the elementary school organized a water filtration fund. Neighbors volunteered to drive elders to clinics when their pipes were shut off for testing. Local environmental groups arrived with equipment and expertise, partnering with government agencies to formulate a long-term plan. Even some of the guilty, stripped of status and rebuttal, began participating in hands-on cleanup efforts, partly from legal compulsion, partly from a desire to atone, and then came the moment I'd orchestrated not with spectacle, but with restraint. I handed over the final piece of evidence to the lead prosecutor, a composite video timeline that fused the surveillance footage, purchase receipts, and secret recordings into a chronological story that left no plausible alternative. The prosecutor watched it once, twice, then set it aside with a steady hand. That night, the arraignments included the new, unambiguous footage. The court's mood shifted. What had been a paper trail and witness statements became incontrovertible action captured in time. The courtroom became the stage for reckoning. Testimonies were read aloud and cross-examined, and as the truth unfolded under oath, a profound settling took place in the community. Where there had been fear, now sat a weary certainty. The narrative of accident that the board had tried to tell was replaced with one of accountability. The legal system, cumbersome and slow, had tilted toward a resolution that acknowledged the scope of the harm. By the end of the chapter's darkest month, the board had been disbanded. Its leaders, once untouchable, would face criminal trials and civil liability that would strip them of any comfort they had once enjoyed. Their names would be associated with the poisoning in perpetuity. More importantly, the residents, fractured and grieving, had the beginning of an answer. They had a pathway to remediation funds, to health screenings, and to a legal precedent that would make anyone think twice about poisoning a water supply. Yet the end of the board was not the end of the story. The lake, my lake, was still wounded. The water that fed the community had to be healed. Families needed peace of mind. Trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The legal victories provided accountability, but they did not and could not return the lake to the way it had been. The community's next work would be different from the battles that had taken place in courtrooms and boardrooms. It would be quieter, more grueling. Testing wells, installing filtration, planting buffer zones, and watching for the small, hopeful signs of recovery. It would also require an admission of failure, a willingness to reimagine governance without the arrogance that had led to this calamity. As the arrests faded from the headlines and the remediation plans moved from spreadsheets to action, I felt the story shift beneath my feet. The revenge that had begun as a private response to harassment had become a public crusade for accountability. I had wanted the HOA to be held responsible, yes, but more than that, I wanted the truth to be known and the community to survive, not in the brittle, performative way it had before, but as something honest and tethered to responsibility. Standing at the edge of the lake one late afternoon, when the light slanted low and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and chlorine from the remediation pumps, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought of the generations who had relied on that water, of the children who would learn this story in years to come, and of how fragile the line is between stewardship and control. The board's fall had been spectacular, necessary, and cathartic. The work of repair, however, was humble and slow, and it was only just beginning. When the handcuffs closed and the board members were led away, a strange quiet fell over the neighborhood. It wasn't the silence of relief. It was heavier, more uncertain. Justice had come in a sharp burst, but life after justice was messy, drawn out, and layered with wounds that would not close quickly. For every arrest warrant and guilty plea, there was a sick child, a ruined garden, or a family debating whether to sell their home and walk away. The legal battles had stripped away the illusion of safety, but they had not rebuilt what was lost. The first signs of the community's recovery were practical, not emotional. Filtration units were installed in basements, humming steadily like guardians against the unseen poison. Environmental engineers walked the shoreline with clipboards and sample jars, their boots sinking into the mud where children once played barefoot. The water pumps set up to cleanse the aquifers worked day and night, loud enough to remind everyone that their safety now depended on machines, not on the trust they once placed in their surroundings. Residents adjusted to a new routine, bottled water deliveries stacked at doorsteps, health checkups scheduled months in advance, local clinics setting up special programs for blood testing and toxin monitoring. What had once been a simple act, filling a glass at the kitchen sink, was now an act of suspicion. Parents boiled, filtered, and tested every drop their children drank. Grandparents, whose bodies were less resilient, lived with constant anxiety about what might already have seeped too deep into their bones. Despite the weight of it all, a flicker of resilience began to emerge. Neighbors who had once only exchanged polite nods at block parties now came together with a raw honesty born of shared suffering. Community meetings were no longer stage-managed performances of control. They were circles of people, sleeves rolled up, voices trembling but sincere. There was anger, yes, but also resolve. The betrayal had bound them together in a way that polished HOA newsletters never could. I became, reluctantly, something of a fixture at those meetings. Not because I sought recognition, but because my evidence had forced this reckoning, and people looked to me as someone who could cut through the lies. I answered questions when I could, guided discussions toward the facts, and reminded them that accountability had been achieved, but healing was a separate task. I watched people learn to speak with each other differently, no longer in whispers about gossip, but in urgent conversations about soil remediation, grant funding, and groundwater testing. The courts did not release their grip on the story. Trials stretched on for months, then years. Some board members took plea deals, their sentences ranging from probation to years in prison, depending on their level of involvement. Others fought until the bitter end, their lawyers weaving defenses that fell flat against the mountain of evidence. Civil lawsuits proceeded alongside criminal charges, and slowly settlements trickled in. Families received checks that felt both necessary and inadequate, money for medical bills and property damage, but no sum large enough to erase the memory of carrying a sick child into an emergency room. Beyond the courtroom, the broader world had taken notice. Environmental advocacy groups descended on the neighborhood, not only to help but to use the incident as a rallying cry for stricter regulations. Journalists wrote follow-up pieces, framing the scandal as an emblem of what happens when small groups of unaccountable people are given unchecked power. The community, once invisible outside its gates, became a symbol, both of failure and of resilience. But symbols do not drink water. The practical work of restoration pressed on, often thankless and exhausting. The lake's ecosystem, once vibrant with reeds, fish, and birds, bore the scars of chemical saturation. Biologists charted its decline with clinical detachment, warning residents that full recovery might take decades. Yet they also offered hope, planting native grasses, building artificial wetlands, introducing microbial treatments that could break down the toxins. Progress was slow, almost invisible, but it was there, measured not in weeks but in seasons. The social landscape healed at a similar pace. Neighbors who had once been divided along invisible lines, those loyal to the board, those skeptical, those silent, now faced the hard truth together. It wasn't easy. Old wounds resurfaced when someone recalled who had defended the board at first, or who had dismissed concerns as paranoia. Some friendships never recovered, but new bonds formed in their place. A quiet solidarity grew, forged in the shared labor of rebuilding. Through it all, I carried my own complicated burden. I had begun my quiet campaign for accountability out of a personal sense of justice, even revenge. But watching the aftermath, I realized how heavy the consequences truly were. Yes, the guilty had fallen, but the innocent had suffered just as much. Children who would carry medical scars for life. Families who would never trust their water again. Elders who would die before seeing the lake restored. My victory was real, but it was also laced with grief. As months turned into a year, small signs of renewal began to pierce the gloom. A heron returned to the lake's edge one dawn, its long legs moving gracefully through the shallows. Saplings planted by volunteers took root and began to green the shoreline. The smell of chemicals that had once hung in the air faded, replaced by the ordinary scent of mud and grass. The water, though still untrustworthy, no longer looked like a mirror of poison but something closer to life. The community marked these milestones with quiet rituals. A potluck dinner by the lake, where filtered water and safe food were shared as symbols of survival. A memorial stone placed near the playground engraved with words about resilience and responsibility. A children's art project that painted colorful fish on the community center walls. A declaration that life would return, even if slowly. I stood apart sometimes, watching these gestures unfold. I had played my part in tearing down the corruption, but the rebuilding belonged to everyone. Healing was not the work of one person. It was the work of a community facing itself honestly for the first time. The neighborhood would never be what it once was. That illusion of perfect lawns and orderly control was shattered forever. But perhaps that was for the best. What rose from the ashes was less polished, but more real, and in the end, that was what mattered. The HOA, once feared and obeyed, was gone. In its place was a community no longer ruled by appearances but bound by shared survival. The scars would remain, etched into the soil, the water, and the memory of every resident. But scars are also proof of endurance. As for me, I carried the satisfaction of truth revealed, tempered by the knowledge that justice always comes at a price. The lake, the community, and even I bore that price. But when I saw children once again riding bikes near the shore, their laughter carrying over the hum of the filtration pumps, I knew the future had room for hope. The story had begun with poison and betrayal, but it ended with something harder, deeper, and more enduring. The slow, stubborn work of healing. And that, neighbors, is where this story ends. A lake poisoned out of spite, a community betrayed by the very people who swore to protect it, and a truth too heavy for the HOA to ever cover up. Their downfall was swift, their legacy destroyed, and the water they thought they could control turned out to be their undoing. But beyond the drama, this tale leaves a reminder. Power unchecked is dangerous, and sometimes the fight for justice is not loud but patient. Healing takes time, scars remain, but resilience is stronger than control. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unbelievable HOA and Karen dramas. And tell me, what would you have done if your neighborhood leaders poisoned your lake? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay sharp, stay strong, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the truth do its work.